Good morning, friends. We're so glad to see you this morning. We're excited that you are with us. If you've been with us the last few weeks, our theme this month is Get Up and Go. We've been looking at Jonah's story, and we saw that God knows us and has a plan for us, and that we can always trust God's plan is best. But sometimes that's not what we do. In fact, that's not what Jonah did. So we left him in the dark, slimy belly of a fish. And we have a fun event coming up tonight to kind of maybe feel what that would have been like. So tell us about that, Miss Ashley.
Yes, this afternoon at 4 p.m., Miss Christy and I were going to be hosting a Facebook Live party where we are going to be making slime together. Yes. So we're going to have some recipes for you. You can grab your supplies and have them ready at 4 p.m. And also be ready with some questions because we'd love to chat with you guys then.
Right, and maybe brush up on the story of Jonah because we might be asking you some questions that you need to answer. And we just want to hear how things are going. And so be ready to write in on Facebook as you watch us live or have a grown-up there to help. But before all of that happens tonight, we need to learn more about Jonah.
Right.
Before we do that, we need to worship. So let's wake up and worship.
Help me sing it now. 1, 2, 3, let's go. I was made to do amazing things. I know. I was made to be his hands and feet. I know. God made me to shine, makes me come alive, makes me wanna live my life for him. God made me to shine, makes me come alive, makes me wanna live my life. Wanna dance, 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 dance all around. I wanna jump, jump, jump and sing out loud. And yes, the light I found, I just can't hide it now. I wanna shout it out to the world. God made me, yeah, and I'm unique, yeah. I wanna go wherever he will lead. I will go. Imagine all the possibilities. Oh, I know. 'Cause God made me to shine, makes me come alive, makes me wanna live my life for him. God made me to shine, makes me come alive, makes me wanna live my life. I wanna dance, 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 dance all around. I wanna jump, jump, jump and sing out loud. And yes, the light I found, I just can't hide it now. I wanna shout it out to the world. Well, I am wired and wonderfully made by desire to sing his praise, shout it louder. I believe God made me to shine. Well, I am wired and wonderfully made by desire to sing his praise, shout it louder. I believe God made me to shine. Oh, God made me to shine, makes me come alive, makes me wanna live my life for him. God made me to shine, makes me come alive, makes me wanna live my life. Wanna dance, 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 dance all around. I wanna jump, 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 sing out loud. Here's the light I found, I just can't hide it now. I wanna shout it out to the world. God made me, yeah, and I'm unique, yeah. God made me, yeah, and I'm unique, yeah. God made me.
Welcome back, friends. When we left Jonah, he was not having a good day. At first, he was stuck on a boat in the middle of a storm, about to die. And then he jumps out. He's thrown out, actually. And we left him in the dark, slimy belly of a fish. And we know that God is waiting for Jonah to turn from his ways and go God's way. But that doesn't happen at first.
No. Last week we saw in Jonah 1:17, Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. What can you do from the belly of a fish? Do you think his cell phone was working? Maybe he was on the app catching up on Wake Up and Worship?
You know, it would have been a good choice for Jonah to be on the Rock Church app, but There were no apps or even electronics back in Jonah's day, and even if there were, I don't think you can get reception in a fish's belly.
No electronics? That sounds awful. Maybe he had a flashlight and he went exploring in the belly like it was a cave. That would be really cool.
That would be so cool. But there were no flashlights or batteries, and I don't think Jonah brought his lantern. I imagine that Jonah was cold from being in the ocean and wet. He was probably hungry because he hadn't eaten for 3 days. It's just Jonah there alone in the dark. Jonah does the only thing that you can do from any time and any place. And you can even do it in the belly of a fish.
Wait, I remember what this is. Jonah prays. Prayer is something that we can do any place, anytime, and about anything. Jonah must finally be realizing that he can't escape God, even in the belly of a fish.
Exactly. It takes Jonah 3 days, but he does finally call out to God. It says in Jonah 2, verse 1, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from inside the fish. At the start of Jonah's prayer, we find out what all of this actually felt like to him. He says in verse 5, I sank beneath the waves and the waters closed over me. Seaweed wrapped itself around my head. Jonah knew he was in trouble.
Right. Jonah felt trapped by the seaweed and the ocean that surrounded him. In his prayer, Jonah says in verse 7, my life was slipping away. He knew he was close to death.
Right. Friends, all of this happens in Jonah's life because he had chosen not to go God's way and to go his way instead. And that was sin. He had sinned against God. Really, sin is anything we think, say, or do that goes against God's ways, just like Jonah did.
This makes me think about how many times I have chosen to go my own way. We all have done it. The Bible tells us that everyone has sinned. Jonah is showing me that we all need to realize that our sin has consequences. We find ourselves in some pretty stinky situations because of our bad choices.
Right. The Bible tells us in Romans 6:23 that the wages or the punishment for sin is death. Sin separates us from God's loving presence forever in hell if we don't follow Jesus. Once we have followed Jesus, our sin can still kind of separate us from God. It doesn't take away the promise of heaven or separate us from God's presence, but it's kind of like if I put on these noise-canceling headphones. When I put them on, all of a sudden, I can't hear Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I can't hear you. It's kind of like that when we sin. All of a sudden, God doesn't feel close and we can't hear him very well. We can't hear his voice because our sin is separating us from him. Oh, that's better.
Today, we see that Jonah realized it was his sin that had caused this big, stinky, fishy mess. So he prays to God. In his prayer, he calls out to God and he says in Jonah 2:9, my salvation comes from the Lord alone. Jonah knows that only God can rescue him.
Just like Jonah, we have to realize who can rescue us, who we're supposed to call out to. The Bible tells us that there is only one way that we can be rescued from our sin.
In John 14:6, Jesus actually calls himself the way. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me.
To go God's way and follow Jesus, all you have to do is call out to God to tell him that you want to do that. It says in Romans 10:13, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Jonah calls out to God, and he tells God that he will stop going his own way and start going God's way. Because Jonah calls out to God, deciding to turn back to his way, Jonah is rescued from the belly of the fish.
Yes, here comes one of my favorite parts of the story. Let's see how God answers Jonah's prayer. In Jonah 2:10, it says, then the Lord ordered the fish to spit Jonah out onto the beach. Isn't that crazy? Can you imagine being in a fish's belly and then being spit out of its mouth onto the beach? I mean, I'd love to go hang out on the beach, but that's not the way that I want to get there. But Jonah is given a second chance to get up and go follow God's plan.
Yeah, I don't want to go to the beach covered in fish guts, cold, hungry. Yeah. Jonah had a hard lesson to learn. The Bible tells us that God knows us and has a plan for us. And that plan is for us to live for God because we love him. We saw last week that 1 John 5:3 says loving God means keeping his commandments or obeying him. But just like Jonah, sometimes we don't do this. Sometimes we choose to disobey.
Right, just like Jonah, we don't always get things right the first time. When that happens, we can do just like Jonah and call out to God in prayer.
When we mess up or sin, a lot of times there are consequences. It's kind of like when we're at home and our parents give us a consequence or a punishment because of our sin or our bad choice. Punishments that we are given as consequence for our sin are called discipline. And the Bible actually says this about discipline. In Hebrews 12:10, it says, God's discipline is always good for us. It actually can help us make good choices.
Discipline is not fun and it doesn't feel very good. How can it be good for us? Can you tell us about that, Miss Christie?
That's a good question. So, when we experience consequences or punishments that discipline for our wrong choices, it's supposed to help us remember the next time that we're in this situation that we should trust that God's plan is best. The next time we're in this situation, we remember what the discipline was like, and we don't want that. And so instead of going our own way again, we choose to follow God's way instead. So discipline is supposed to help us remember to get up and go God's way. Jonah didn't get this right at first, but he's finally ready to follow God's plan. He's ready to get up and go God's way.
Friends, when you get off track because you decide to go your way instead of God's way, call out to God and tell him you need him. Pray just like Jonah did. Psalm 145:18 tells us, "The Lord is near to all who call upon him."
That's right. So call on God and tell him that you're sorry. And not just sorry that you got in trouble or because you want your consequence to end, but tell him that you're really sorry because you messed up. Tell him you're sorry that when you sinned, you weren't loving him the way that you should have. And you're sorry for the separation that your sin has caused between you and him. Tell him you want to be close to him again. Jonah does this. He calls out to God and he says he's sorry that he separated himself from him. And because of that, he's rescued.
Yes, so Jonah prays, "As my life was slipping away, I remembered the Lord, and my earnest prayer went out to you." Miss Christie, what does the word earnest mean?
Earnest means that you are really serious. You really mean it. When Jonah prayed in earnest, he really meant his prayer. He really meant that he was sorry, and he knew that his sin had really caused big trouble in his life. And so he tells God earnestly, "I really mean this. I am serious. I am sorry for my sin." He tells God that he wants to go God's way and not his way. God heard Jonah's earnest prayer from the belly of a fish, and we can be sure that God always hears our prayer too.
Right, when we find ourselves in the middle of the consequence that we know is the result of our sin, do what Jonah did. Remember the Lord and pray. Ask him to help you go his way instead. Our bottom line today is God helps me follow his plan when I pray.
God knows you and has a plan for you, and you can trust that God's plan is best. But when you're having a hard time and you forget that, God can help you follow his plan when you pray. If you are going your own way instead of God's way, call out to him, tell him you're sorry, and choose to go his way instead.
Right, he loves you and he wants to help, and he can hear you from anywhere, even in the belly of a fish.
Bye, friends. We'll see you today at 4 o'clock.